Palestine and Israel, A History of Two Nations, One Land, read and published by Mr. Books. Few places on earth evoke such profound passions, memories, and controversies as the narrow strip of land stretching from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Known variously as Palestine, the Holy Land, or Israel, its very names symbolize the multiplicity of identities and histories. No larger than many modern cities, this land has been the nexus of empires, the cradle of major world religions, and the focal point of an unrelenting struggle between two nations, each bound to it by centuries of faith, memory, trauma, and aspiration. This book, Palestine and Israel, A History of Two Nations, One Land, endeavors to present a sweeping, descriptive, yet nuanced narrative of this contested space. We begin at the dawn of civilization, where the first city-states and tribal federations took root, and journey through the myriad rulers, faiths, and cultures that shaped the land. From the Israelites and Philistines, chronicled in biblical accounts, to the Byzantines, Crusaders, and Muslim dynasties, each layer of history left lasting imprints on the land's identity. The story of Palestine and Israel is not merely a record of conflict, but is, fundamentally, a chronicle of human experience of coexistence, flourishing cities, innovation and art, migration and tragedy. In the modern era, the rise of nationalist movements, Zionism among Jews and Palestinian nationalism among Arabs, irrevocably altered the trajectory of the land. The collapse of empires, the brutality of World War II, and international machinations all converged, giving rise to the establishment of Israel in 1948 and the resultant Palestinian Nakba. Yet, tragedy is only one facet. The resilience, hope, and creativity of both peoples cannot be overlooked. As the world has looked on, sometimes with interest, often with impotence, the people of Palestine and Israel have woven new identities, launched movements for justice and peace, mourned together in times of catastrophe, and celebrated rare moments of reconciliation. This volume does not seek easy answers, nor does it offer simplistic narratives. Instead, it strives to honor the complexity, pain, and beauty of two nations whose histories are inseparable from one another, bound by the very land they contest and cherish. By exploring the origins and evolution of their struggles, aspirations, and identities, readers are invited to understand not only the intractable conflict, but also the enduring human impulses that persist amid adversity.
Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life. Now let's begin. Enjoy.
Palestine and Israel, A History of Two Nations, One Land, read and published by Mr. Books *******. Few places on earth evoke such profound passions, memories, and controversies as the narrow strip of land stretching from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Known variously as Palestine, the Holy Land, or Israel, its very names symbolize the multiplicity of identities and histories. No larger than many modern cities, this land has been the nexus of empires, the cradle of major world religions, and the focal point of an unrelenting struggle between two nations, each bound to it by centuries of faith, memory, trauma, and aspiration. This book, Palestine and Israel, A History of Two Nations, One Land, endeavors to present a sweeping, descriptive, yet nuanced narrative of this contested space. We begin at the dawn of civilization, where the first city-states and tribal federations took root, and journey through the myriad rulers, faiths, and cultures that shaped the land. From the Israelites and Philistines, chronicled in biblical accounts, to the Byzantines, Crusaders, and Muslim dynasties, each layer of history left lasting imprints on the land's identity. the story of Palestine and Israel is not merely a record of conflict, but is, fundamentally, a chronicle of human experience of coexistence, flourishing cities, innovation and art, migration and tragedy. In the modern era, the rise of nationalist movements, Zionism among Jews and Palestinian nationalism among Arabs, irrevocably altered the trajectory of the land. The collapse of empires, the brutality of World War II, and international machinations all converged, giving rise to the establishment of Israel in 1948 and the resultant Palestinian Nakba. Yet, tragedy is only one facet. The resilience, hope, and creativity of both peoples cannot be overlooked. As the world has looked on sometimes with interest, often with impotence, the people of Palestine and Israel have woven new identities, launched movements for justice and peace, mourned together in times of catastrophe, and celebrated rare moments of reconciliation. This volume does not seek easy answers, nor does it offer simplistic narratives. Instead, it strives to honor the complexity, pain, and beauty of two nations whose histories are inseparable from one another, bound by the very land they contest and cherish. By exploring the origins and evolution of their struggles, aspirations, and identities, readers are invited to understand not only the intractable conflict, but also the enduring human impulses that persist amid adversity. Chapter 2. Empires and Faiths. Transformations through Conquest ***. As the Iron Age waned and the Age of Empires dawned, the land of Palestine and Israel found itself with ever-changing overlords and spiritual influences. Each conquest brought both destruction and innovation, uprooting old orders while seeding new cultures. This was an age where faith and power worked in symbiosis, and where the fates of cities and peoples were both forged and appended by imperial ambitions. The Assyrian and Babylonian tempests. By the 8th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire radiated power from the north, seeking to expand its sphere of control. City-states that once flourished under Canaanite or Israelite rule were subjected to siege, tribute, and exile. The northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722 BCE, with its population scattered in what survivors remembered as one of history's earliest exiles. Only decades later, the southern kingdom of Judah faced its own calamity with Babylon's rise. Jerusalem's first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, its treasures carted away, and much of the elite population marched east into captivity. But exile was not obliteration. In Babylon, the Israelites honed and recorded their traditions, fostering texts and rituals that would sustain them across generations. Meanwhile, the land itself depopulated, yet not empty, underwent cycles of redevelopment as new settlers arrived and remaining communities adapted to new political realities. Persian and Hellenistic Renaissance. The Persian conquest in 539 BCE marked a dramatic reversal. King Cyrus, famed for his policy of tolerance, allowed exiled peoples, including the Judeans, to return and rebuild. The Second Temple rose atop the ruins of the first, inaugurating centuries of religious and communal renewal under Persian suzerainty. The land became a patchwork of semi-autonomous priestly states, punctuated by periods of peace and brief spasms of revolt. The arrival of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, he heralded another epoch. Hellenistic rule by the Ptolemies and Seleucids brought Greek language, philosophy, and urban design. Cities like Sebaste and Caesarea Maritima flourished. Gymnasiums, theaters, and inscriptions in Greek dotted the landscape. Yet this transmission of culture was not always harmonious. The Maccabean revolt of the 2nd century BCE, led by the Hasmonean dynasty, was a fierce assertion of Jewish religious autonomy against perceived Hellenizing pressures. Roman domination and the rise of Christianity by the 1st century BCE, Roman legions had subdued much of the eastern Mediterranean, incorporating Judea as a client kingdom and as a directly governed province. Heavy taxation and often brutal governance stoked resentment, leading to the great Jewish revolts of 66 to 70 CE and 132 to 135 CE. In the aftermath, Jerusalem's Second Temple was razed, and Jews were barred from much of the city, replaced in many areas by Romang and pagan settlements. Simultaneously, a new religious stir was emerging. The teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, crucified in Jerusalem under Roman procurators, inspired a small following that began to spread throughout the empire. By the 4th century, under Constantine, Christianity would become the dominant faith, not only in Palestine and Israel, but across Roman lands. The region now became packed with churches, monasteries, and pilgrims as new sacred geographies took hold. Byzantines, Persians, and the coming of Islam, the Byzantine era saw further Christianization, with the architectural flowering of basilicas and pilgrim hostels. Yet geopolitical rivalries continued to sweep the land. The Persian Sassanids briefly conquered parts of it in the early 7th century, only to be driven out by the resurgent Byzantines. Then, in 638 CE, came the fateful entry of Muslim Arab armies. Jerusalem surrendered peacefully to Caliph Umar, marking the beginning of Islamic rule, a turning point that established new religious dynamics. The Dome of the Rock in Al-Aqsa Mosque rose on the Temple Mount, site of ancient Hebrew sanctuaries, a powerful symbol of both continuity and change. A patchwork of peoples and faiths. Through centuries of empire, the land absorbed successive waves of Arabs, Christian pilgrims, and Jewish communities, some returning, others persisting from ancient times. Small towns and rural villages maintained diverse populations, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Samaritans living in proximity, sometimes in tension, oftentimes in pragmatic coexistence. Thus, by the dawn of the 2nd millennium, Palestine and Israel formed a mosaic of languages, faiths, and customs, layered thick with memories of conquest and resilience. The legacies of empires Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Romang, and Islamic each left indelible marks on the land's culture, architecture, and collective imagination. It is this legacy of resilience, amid perpetual transformation, that would gird the region for the storms yet to come and shape the ambitions and tragedies of both Palestinians and Israelis as each sought new futures in an ancient land. Chapter 3. From Ottoman rule to British mandate. By the early 16th century, after another succession of upheavals, a new imperial power took hold over Palestine and the wider region, the Ottoman Empire, which would rule for nearly 4 centuries. The Ottoman centuries were transformative. They shaped the demographics, administrative boundaries, and cultural textures of the land. They also set the stage for the radical shifts of the 20th century, when the simmering embers of nationalism and European colonial ambition collided upon this ancient soil. Ottoman structures and rural life. The Ottomans incorporated the region into their sprawling empire in 1517, following conquest from the Mamluk Sultanate. Organized primarily as part of the province of Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, administrative boundaries shifted numerous times. Large towns like Jerusalem, Nablus, Hebron, and Gaza flourished as regional centers, connected by pilgrimage and trade routes north to Damascus and south to Egypt, that the Ottomans governed through mixed systems of direct rule and delegated authority. Village headmen, tax farmers, and local notables wielded significant influence. The landscape remained overwhelmingly rural, characterized by small Arab Muslim farming villages. Christian communities, especially in towns like Bethlehem and Nazareth, A modest but enduring Jewish presence, mostly in Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, and Hebron. Life in these centuries was shaped by the rhythms of agriculture and pilgrimage. Bazaars bustled with traders from Arabic-speaking locals to Armenian craftsmen and Sephardic Jewish merchants. The holy sites of Jerusalem attracted pilgrims from all over the empire and Europe, infusing the city with a cosmopolitan air. Still, periodic famines, plagues, and tribal disturbances punctuated the relative calm. Modernizing currents and social change. The 19th century brought seismic changes. Ottoman reformers, navigating the pressures of European encroachment and internal decline, launched a series of modernizations known as the Tanzimat. These reforms altered land ownership laws, spurred infrastructural investment, fostered new schools, and set the groundwork for a modern state bureaucracy. Local elites in Palestine and the wider Levant were drawn increasingly into international trade and diplomatic networks. Most transformative was the lateness and unevenness of modernization. While cities like Jaffa and Jerusalem experienced population booms and the rise of a new Arab middle class, rural areas often remained stagnant, buffeted by changing tax regimes and predations from nomadic tribes. Simultaneously, the migration of Jews from Europe, especially after the Russian pogroms of the 1880s, slowly increased, funded by nascent Zionist movements and philanthropic organizations. The seeds of political unrest. By the turn of the 20th century, Palestine had become a focus both for Ottoman centralization and for foreign ambitions. World powers Great Britain, France, Germany, and Russia jockeyed for influence, often under the guise of protecting religious minorities or archaeological missions. At the same time, Arab reformers and intellectuals began to articulate new forms of national identity, inspired by both Ottomanist and pan-Arab ideals. The influx of Jewish settlers, initially small but steadily growing, began to alter the demographic and economic composition of regions such as the Jezreel Valley and the coastal plain. Zionist organizations purchased land, sometimes displacing tenant farmers, a trend that would soon become a flashpoint for conflict. Collapse, war, and British ascendance. World War I was a cataclysm for the Ottoman world. In Palestine, British and Allied forces campaigned against the Turks, often working with local Arab leaders through promises of post-war independence. The 1917 Balfour Declaration, a British pledge to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, sent shockwaves through both the resident Arab population and the wider world. When the war ended and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain assumed control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. What had once been a relatively stable, if peripheral, province of the Ottoman polity was now a site of rapidly escalating tension and transformation as hopes, fears, and irreconcilable promises collided. A land at the crossroads. Thus ended centuries of imperial governance under the Ottomans, but not the story of overlapping identities, resilience, or contest. The late Ottoman era left a legacy of layered communities: Arabs and Jews, Christians and Muslims, peasants and urbanites, now thrust into the flux of modernization, colonialism, and the birth pangs of new nationalisms. The British Mandate era, fraught with conflicting ambitions, would see these trends accelerate, soon erupting into violence and forging the fault lines that still define Palestine and Israel today. Chapter 4. Seeds of Conflict, Zionism, Arab Nationalism, and the Great Upheaval. The closing years of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th marked the emergence of powerful new ideologies, Zionism and Arab nationalism, that would fundamentally reshape the fate of Palestine and Israel. These ideologies, each born from particular histories of suffering and aspiration, would come to define two new visions for the land. Their collision, not inevitable, but deeply rooted in global and local upheavals, set the stage for the seismic transformations and traumas that would follow. Zionism. Yearning and returned Zionism arose in late 19th century Europe amidst deepening anti-Semitism, pervasive exclusion, and sporadic violence against Jews, epitomized by pogroms in the Russian Empire. For Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, and other movement leaders, the solution lay not in assimilation, but in the re-establishment of a Jewish homeland, ideally in the land remembered and sanctified through centuries of prayer and longing. Zionism was not monolithic. It encompassed secular socialists seeking collective farming, the kibbutz, religious traditionalists returning to the land of the Torah, and urban dreamers hoping for a modern national renewal. What united them was a vision of Aliyah, ascent, the return to build anew in the ancestral homeland. Early Jewish migrants established agricultural colonies and communal settlements, often seeking to work the land with their own hands. Arab nationalism, awakening and resistance. Meanwhile, the Arab world, itself undergoing an awakening, against both Ottoman decline and imperial encroachment, witnessed the birth of Palestinian nationalism. Palestinian Arabs, Muslims, Christians, and smaller minorities began to frame their own claims to the land, not only as residents of their ancestral home, but as part of a wider Arab nation. Newspapers, literary societies, and political clubs flourished in Jaffa, Jerusalem, and Nablus, promoting visions of unity, modernity, and self-determination. Increasingly, the local population viewed the influx of Jewish immigrants and land purchases with anxiety, fearing dispossession, economic displacement, and cultural erosion. As early as 1920, violent clashes erupted in response to new settlements, British favoritism, and rumors of radical intentions. Colonial promises and betrayals. The British Mandate, inherited from the Ottoman collapse, was riven with contradictions. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 promised a national home for the Jewish people, yet also pledged to safeguard the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish population. Arab leaders throughout the Middle East, including local notables in Palestine, had been courted by the British with ambiguous offers of autonomy, most famously in the correspondences with Sharif Hussein of Mecca. This maze of promises was further complicated by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, secretly dividing the Levant between Britain and France, and by the mandate system itself, a thinly veiled form of colonialism. Under British rule, infrastructure and legal systems advanced, but political frustrations mounted as both communities saw their aspirations thwarted. Escalation and the Great Revolt. By the 1930s, mounting tensions erupted into the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a mass uprising of Palestinian Arabs against British rule and growing Jewish settlement. Strikes, attacks, and brutal counterinsurgency measures followed. Far from resolving the land's dilemmas, the revolt deepened mistrust and left lasting scars. Britain, caught between conflicting allegiances, began to limit Jewish immigration, infuriating Jews, especially as Nazi persecution intensified, while also disappointing Arab hopes for independence. Entrenching division amid all this economic separation grew as Jewish and Arab communities developed parallel institutions, labor unions, schools, and defense organizations increasingly insulated from one another. The lines of estrangement hardened, a sense of us versus them, each group carrying historical wounds, and convinced of the justice of its cause, got by the close of the Mandate era in the 1940s. Palestine and Israel were not merely lands of overlapped histories, but geographies of imminent rupture, poised between hopes for national renewal and fears of permanent loss. The ground was laid for a conflict that would define the region for decades, and whose shadows still linger today. Chapter 5, 1948, The Birth of Catastrophe and Independence asterisk. The year 1948 looms as an inflection point, reshaping destinies and redefining identities across the land. For Zionist Jews, it heralded the long-awaited fulfillment of a national dream as the State of Israel declared its independence. For Palestinian Arabs, it marked the Nakba, the catastrophe when villages were depopulated, families uprooted, and a centuries-old presence was violently shaken. The seeds of 1948 had been sown decades earlier, as waves of Jewish immigration met Arab resistance, and British colonial policies vacillated between promises and realities. As the British Mandate neared its end, tensions became explosive. The United Nations, seeking a solution, proposed in 1947 a partition plan that would create separate Jewish and Arab states with Jerusalem under international administration. Celebrated by Jews, this plan was rejected by Arab leaders, who saw it as an imposition and a violation of self-determination. War erupted almost immediately. Militant groups, including the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi for the Jews, and several Palestinian Arab militias, vied for control of territory as the British withdrew. The period between late 1947 and May 14, 1948 witnessed mass violence as both communities fought for survival and supremacy. When David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded. The ensuing conflict, known as the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, was brutal and transformative. For Israeli Jews, the war was existential. Scarred by the Holocaust, they viewed self-defense as imperative. Despite being outnumbered, Israel managed not only to survive, but to expand its territory beyond the UN partition lines. For Palestinians, the consequences were devastating. Over 700,000 people became refugees, fleeing or being expelled from their homes. Hundreds of villages were erased. Families were separated, and the trauma seared itself into the collective consciousness. The legacy of 1948 was immediate and enduring. The refugee issue became one of the central and most intractable elements of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Palestinian society, which had been primarily agrarian and local, was fragmented and dispersed. Neighboring Arab countries absorbed refugees amidst resentment and political upheaval, while the new Israeli state had to absorb waves of Jewish immigrants from Europe and the Arab world. Internationally, the conflict set the stage for decades of instability. The United States and the Soviet Chapter 6. Decades of War and Occupation asterisk. The end of the 1948 war did not bring peace. Instead, it ushered in decades of conflict, shifting alliances, and repeated cycles of violence and negotiation. The so-called Green Line demarcated the armistice frontiers, but it was never recognized as an official border. Gaza came under Egyptian administration, while the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was annexed by Jordan. The Palestinian dream of statehood remained elusive, and the pain of exile festered. The years between 1949 and 1967 were marked by border skirmishes, guerrilla attacks, and retaliations. Israel, investing heavily in immigration and national development, faced regional hostility and insecurity. Palestinian refugees languished in camps, where the dream of return was passed from one generation to the next. Arab governments oscillated between rhetoric and action, unable to present a unified political or military front. The Six-Day War of June 1967 transformed the landscape yet again. In 6 days, Israel captured the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights. A victory was stunning, but it sowed seeds for deeper conflict. Over 1 million Palestinians now lived under Israeli military occupation. East Jerusalem was annexed, dramatically changing the city's demographics and spiritual symbolism. Occupation brought with it a new reality: military rule, curfews, land expropriations, and the construction of settlements began almost immediately. For Palestinians, life under occupation was marked by humiliation, economic hardship, restricted movement, and a growing sense of disenfranchisement. For Israelis, the newly acquired territories presented both opportunity and dilemma, with some seeing them as strategic buffer zones and others as biblical birthrights. The world watched as the situation grew more complex. The United Nations passed Resolution 242, calling for withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for peace, but implementation faltered. The Palestinian National Movement, meanwhile, underwent a transformation. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, founded in 1964, emerged as the voice of Palestinian aspirations. Guerrilla warfare, hijackings, and international campaigns put the Palestinian plight on the world stage. The 1970s and 1980s saw repeated wars, notably the 1973 Yom Kippur, October War, which reaffirmed Israel's military dominance, but also led to the historic Camp David Accords and peace with Egypt. Lebanon became a new theater of conflict. As the PLO relocated there, and Israeli invasions targeted militant bases, culminating in the 1982 siege of Beirut. All the while, settlement construction in the West Bank and Gaza accelerated, setting the stage for further friction. Palestinian resistance found a new form in 1987 with the outbreak of the First Intifada, a spontaneous uprising of youth, laborers, and civil society against Israeli occupation, marked by protests, strikes, and civil disobedience. Through these decades, the pattern was unrelenting. War, temporary calm, failed negotiations, more violence. Each cycle added layers of grievance, loss, and distrust, while hopes for peace seemed ever more distant. Chapter 7. The Pursuit of Peace, Oslo Intifadas, and Stalled Hopes Asterisk. In the early 1990s, after decades of violence and stalemate, hope flickered anew. The Cold War's end, shifting regional alliances, and the fatigue of endless conflict created a window for diplomacy. Against a backdrop of Intifada unrest, secret negotiations between Israeli and Palestinian representatives began in Norway. Away from the glare of the world's media. The result, the Oslo Accords of 1993. On the White House lawn, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands, watched by Bill Clinton and the world. The agreements established limited Palestinian self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza under the newly formed Palestinian Authority. Mutual recognition was achieved. Palestinians saw a pathway to statehood, while Israel hoped for an end to violence. But optimism soon collided with reality. The Oslo process was marked by ambiguity on key issues: Jerusalem, refugees, borders, and settlements remained unresolved. Extremists on both sides opposed compromise. Waves of suicide bombings, Israeli settlement expansion, and the assassination of Rabin in 1995 dealt heavy blows to mutual trust. The Second Intifada, 2000 to 2005, shattered the Oslo vision. A failed summit at Camp David, followed by Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, sparked widespread Palestinian protests and a harsh Israeli response. Violence spiraled. Bombings, invasions, house demolitions, and targeted assassinations. The construction of the Israeli West Bank barrier physically reinforced the separation and deepened psychological divisions. Efforts at peacemaking since Oslo have met repeated obstacles. The Roadmap for Peace, the Annapolis Conference, and various regional initiatives all faltered. Internal Palestinian divisions, especially between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, compounded the impasse. Despite this, the yearning for peace endures among many ordinary Israelis and Palestinians. Civil society groups continue grassroots dialogue. International actors hover on the periphery, alternately cajoling and retreating. The possibility of a two-state solution remains both a distant hope and a source of bitter contention. Chapter 8: Contemporary Realities, Narratives, Borders, and the Future * Today. The situation in Palestine and Israel is shaped not just by borders and walls, but by narratives, myriad stories of identity, loss, triumph, and longing. On both sides, history and memory are fiercely contested, shaping education, politics, and society. Israel continues to develop technologically and economically, gaining new regional diplomatic partners while expanding settlements in the West Bank. The city of Jerusalem remains an epicenter of religious devotion and political tension. Within Israel, Arab citizens grapple with questions of equality, integration, and belonging. For Palestinians, life remains defined by fragmentation. The West Bank encircled by the wall and settlements under tenuous Palestinian self-rule. Gaza, blockaded and scarred by recurrent wars. Refugees in neighboring countries, holding on to keys and memories of lost homes. Young Palestinians navigate checkpoints, economic hardship, and the daily uncertainties of occupation that the world's gaze returns to the region every time conflict flares. Yet a solution remains elusive. New discourse centers on possibilities. Beyond the two-state paradigm, confederations, shared sovereignties, or civil rights within a single state. Increasingly, grassroots activists push for justice, equality, and reconciliation outside official channels. Yet peace is hindered by deep skepticism, trauma, and political inertia. Leaders on all sides face pressures from domestic constituencies, regional rivals, and global powers. International law, public opinion, and the shifting sands of geopolitics all play roles in what comes next. The future remains unwritten. Whether it will be one marked by further division or the slow craft of reconciliation depends on the narratives embraced and the visions dared. In this land, history's weight is immense, but so too is the human capacity for renewal.
If you found this video helpful, inspiring, or entertaining, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on future content. Your support means the world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.